Question 3 on paper 2 is the analysis question. So we're going to spend a bit of time now looking at this and thinking about how we analyse specific and structural devices across a whole text in terms of how they're being used to make that text interesting for readers. So let's recap question 3. Question 3 is worth 15 marks, so that tells you you need to provide a more extended analysis. It's an analysis of the whole of text 1. You have to consider the whole thing. Now remember, when we're talking about a whole text, we're talking about a text that is 300 to 350 words. So it's quite a short text, but you are expected to consider all of it as a whole text. When you are analysing the text, you need to work through that text sequentially. So you need to start with the title or the headline, then the strapline, the opening paragraph, and work your way through until you get to the end of it. You shouldn't be jumping around. You should be trying to work out how the language devices build up and how they work together to have an impact on the reader. It requires an analysis of how specific language and structural devices have been used to make that text interesting for the intended readers. Okay, and as I said earlier, you must write about both language and structural devices. If you only write about one of those, you can't get more than half marks. And you need to also bring into play your understanding of SPAF, so that you are writing about why the text is interesting for the original intended target audience, given the intended purpose of the text. Your response, as I said, must include this analysis of specific language and structural devices, which you have to refer to using the correct technical terms. The way that you provide your response is as a PED essay, point, evidence, explanation, development, with embedded quotations. And in terms of the skills required, well, we've got reading for meaning, inferential reading, scanning, and information retrieval skills. So you can see how the skills, that they're testing more skills through these longer, higher tariff questions. So how do you respond appropriately to question 3? Well, this question is asking for an analysis of the effects of language and structure on a reader, on the intended audience for text 1. It's important to remember that you may not be the intended audience for that text. You have to bring into play your understanding of SPAF. You have to work out, based on the subject matter, the form and the purpose of that text, who was originally intended to read that. So for example, if you have a letter between family members, you are not the intended audience for that. Therefore, the language features that are interesting to the intended audience, which is the person that's being written to, might not interest and engage you. You need to think about why they would interest and engage the person who's being written to. Okay. Similarly, if you've got the text for a speech, you may not be the intended audience for that. You need to think about what interests that audience. So as you start to work through the text, you need to keep the intended audience in mind and constantly ask yourself why they, not you, would find the language and structural devices interesting and engaging. When you do start to analyse the text, start at the beginning. Start with the title, the headline, whatever it might be, the opening sentence. That will be designed very deliberately to appeal directly to the intended audience, and that is always where you should start with your analysis. You then need to work sequentially through the text, so you deal with the title, the headline, or the opening sentence. You then look at the strapline, the subheading, and then the sort of paragraph under the opening sentence, and then move on to the opening paragraph or the opening section, depending on how that text is split up and how it's structured. When you are commenting on the effect of the devices you're identifying, try to consider the purpose of the text. Try to think about why that text was written. What was the writer hoping to achieve? Remember, these non-fiction texts are written to argue, to persuade, to advise, to inform, to explain, and sometimes to entertain as well. So what was the original intention in writing that text? How did that writer want their intended target audience to respond, and think about how the devices they've chosen to use achieve that. All right, let's look now in a bit more detail at how that would work. Okay, so as with all of these, our starting point is the question. With the question on paper 2, the very first word tells you directly to analyse. Okay, so there is no ambiguity about this, there's no confusion about what you're being asked to do. You are told directly to analyse. And if that wasn't enough, they also include the word how. That is there to indicate that you are being asked to write about the effects of language and structural features, not just identify them. We then get this sort of key term in these questions reminding you to comment on language and structure. Remember, you must do that to get more than half marks. And then this term here, this is the wording of question 3, to interest and engage the readers, and that simply means what deliberate choices has the writer of this text made to make it interesting and appealing to the intended audience, given the subject matter, given the purpose, and given the form. How are they making deliberate choices and consciously crafting their text to appeal to their readers? This question is worth 15 marks. You must provide a full PED essay, and that full PED essay must remain focused on the effects that the specific language and structural elements have in terms of making the text interesting. So here we have a letter. Letters are literary non-fiction texts, and you need to remember that one of the texts in section A of paper 2 will always be a literary non-fiction text. And the reason I'm showing you this is because this is a good example of a text where we are not the intended reader, we are not the intended audience for this. And so in terms of analysing the effects and the impact of the language, we need to keep in mind who this was written to. And letters are a good example of this because they're usually written from one person to somebody else. So this is the letter from Tolkien to his sons. It's written, as you can see at the top, Christmas 1925. And if we look at it, there's some quite interesting things going on in here. You can tell that the children are quite young from the language that's used in here. So he's pretending to be Father Christmas, writing to the children. And he starts with this very informal, very affectionate address to them, "My dear boys." Okay, that isn't what you'd expect from a letter, because you'd expect a letter to start dear and then the name of whoever they're writing to, or dear boys, but he writes "my dear boys." So that immediately starts to establish some kind of relationship, some kind of personality of the writer. He then goes on with this opening sentence, "I'm dreadfully busy this year," uses the hyphen, which obviously as a piece of punctuation is a structural thing. "It makes my hand more shaky than ever when I think of it, and not very rich." And that hyphen is enclosing sort of an afterthought, an additional thought, which tells you how distressed this writer is, how upset Father Christmas is about what's happening, because he's writing to the boys, but he's been so busy that he can't write a really good letter, so he's apologising. And the hyphenation and the insertion of that extra piece of information shows how busy he is, because he can't get his thoughts in order very clearly. The other thing that we notice immediately here is this whole letter is just one long paragraph. Okay, and actually structurally it's incorrect. There are places where there should have been paragraph breaks, but it's been written as one long paragraph. Now, Tolkien, the writer of Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and various other texts, he knows how to paragraph. So this isn't a mistake, this is deliberate. And what it's doing is showing that the character that he's adopting, the character of Father Christmas, is very upset, and he's trying to get all of his information down all at once. And if we look at the language, that's also borne out in the language. We get the repetition of the connective "and." In fact, awful things have been happening, and some of the presents have got spoiled, and I haven't got the North Polar Bear to help me, and I have had to move house just before Christmas. So you can imagine what a state everything is in, and you will see why I have a new dress, and why I can only write one letter between you both. So we get this very long, multi-clause, complex sentence with all these subordinate clauses, and they're all joined with that connective "and." that creates a very fast pace. It also makes it sound quite childish, and that's what I mean by the language reflecting the needs of the reader. So these boys are quite young, and the way that Tolkien writes kind of mimics the way that young children speak. They often do speak in a very kind of rushed way, with all these subordinate clauses joined with the connective and, as they're trying to get their thoughts out to us. And then as we go on, we get this really interesting thing here. It happened like this. So this is the start of the story. So that opening section, which actually should have been a paragraph in its own right, sets up the scenario. So he lists all of the reasons why this isn't a very good letter, and then he signals, he signposts the start of the story, the narrative that he's telling in this, with "it all happened like this," and then the use of the semicolon indicates that we're now into the narrative, the story, the description. And then we get lots of descriptive details in here. He refers to the NP bear, the North Polar bear, who usually helps him, and describes what he does. So he talks about him climbing up this pole to get the hat. It's quite a comic scenario that Tolkien's invented here for the entertainment of his children. So he's using storytelling devices. So structurally, he's using that kind of that sort of 5-part narrative structure that we're familiar with from thinking about imaginative writing, and he tells us what happened, and we get all of the details in there. We then get the use of these kind of afterthoughts. And the MP bear's leg got broken. He's well now again, but I was so cross with him that he says he won't try and help me again. And again, the tone of that is very childish, so the language is very very childish. The other thing to notice is that to us the language seems quite old-fashioned. So from the very opening address, "My dear boys," that sounds quite old-fashioned, but you have to remember this was written in 1925. We then get the names of the children, so John, Michael and Christopher. Okay, so he makes it personal to them. So that suggests to them that Father Christmas he knows them and he's watching them. If you think about the kind of things we tell children, you know, Father Christmas is watching you, so you've got to be good. It backs up that idea. So all of the language in here, along with the structure, is designed to engage these young boys. It's not designed to engage us as 21st century adult, older readers. It's designed to engage young boys in 1925, just before Christmas. So I wanted to show you that as an example of what I mean by not assuming you are the intended reader, and being very clear about both the original intended audience and the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to entertain these young boys, all right, and to remind them that Father Christmas is watching, so they better be good.